Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started on our third panel for today. As people begin to trickle back in, I know they'll start making their way back in soon, just so we don't get too far behind here as well. But we have a little bit of breathing space with this panel. Unfortunately, one of the panelists, Meg Rithmire, will be unable to join us, was not feeling well today, so we will just have three panelists and our moderator. We'll try to extend this one until around 3 o'clock, so there's plenty of time, but obviously, hopefully have more time now for engagement with the audience as well, which will be great. So this will give the opportunity to ask more questions and things like that, which is one of the things we hope will happen at this event. So this is the panel on political economy and markets. The panel is being moderated by Professor Mark Wu, who is the director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, and he's also the Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law at Harvard University. And sitting to his left is William Overholt. He's the Senior Research Fellow at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. And then to his left, you've already been introduced to. This is Professor Ezra Vogel, the Ilhan New Professor of Asian Studies, Professor of Political Science and Political Economy, and the Director of the Political Economy Program at the University of California at Berkeley. And then on the end to Stephen's left is Kristen Looney, who is an assistant professor of Asian Studies and Government at Georgetown University. And I will turn it over to Mark then.
Great, thank you very much, James, and thank you to the Asia Center, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. This panel, as you all know, is on political economy and markets, and I think this is an area where Professor Vogel's influence was felt not just in the academy, but truly within politics, within the economic policy-making space, and within markets. It was one where he was such a superstar in terms of his opinion was being sought throughout. But I want to focus us particularly on the field of political economy and the impact that he had there. And as Professor Kim mentioned this morning, in an age where the trend in the economy, in academia was moving towards regressions, was treating Asia as an outlier, was thinking about stochastic noise. He reminded us that political economy is not simply about running data sets and numbers. It's about understanding the actors and the societies behind politics and behind the economy. In a time where regional specialists were increasingly focused on one country, he reminded us that ideas have no borders and that they transcend countries, and that developments in one part of Asia have spillover effects and externalities in other parts, and that's through politics, that's through the economy, that's through societies. And finally, I think he reminded us that through his work, not just Japan as number one, which certainly caught the attention, but also certainly the Four Little Dragons, looking at the spread of industrialization across Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea. In his work, as is already discussed this morning, on One Step Ahead in China, Guangdong under reform. At another perilous time in U.S.-China relations, he reminded us that these societies, although they are linked together by a shared Asian heritage, also have dynamics of their own, and we need to consider that. And I think in many ways, his curiosity, but also his work as a sociologist and his desire to engage deeply with people brought all of that to the fore. So let me start, Bill, with you. If you could talk a little bit as somebody who was operating in these markets, was speaking to economic policymakers, was enmeshed in the politics of all this. As you step back now from the perch of the academy, how do you think about Ezra and his legacy in this area?
Well, let me talk more about Ezra in the context of thinking about political economy. Ezra shaped my whole scholarly career from freshman year in 1964 to the week before his death. If I start talking about that, we'll never mention political economy. So just the fact that we're talking about his influence on political economy when he was a sociologist, starts to tell us something important about Ezra. He had no grand theory of political economy. He had no particular galactic hypotheses within a political economy. He taught us about specific political economies. Let me try to locate Ezra's star among the galaxies, because I think it tells us something important about what we need to do. He specialized in particular countries and particular societies at a time when that was going out of style. He became a sociologist when sociology wasn't the hottest galaxy in the firmament. He paid a lifelong price for that, and he was very sensitive about it. When his Dung biography found acclaim, he said to me, "Well, finally some people around here are taking me seriously." Ezra and colleagues like Dwight Perkins just made it into academia before the galactic shift. I was a little younger. I came to Harvard to be a mathematician and was enticed into the social sciences by Ezra Vogel. I thought I could go on to combine my quantitative skills with deep regional knowledge learned from Ezra. Boy, was that naive. I went to Yale's political science department. The first message was I was going to be banned from continuing my study of Chinese language. The world-renowned Institute of Southeast Asian Studies was being gradually shut down during the 3 years I was there. Yale has not had a tenured professor of Chinese politics in the 50 years since I left there. At Harvard, the revolution was much more benign. Here, you're allowed to have a great career publishing first-rate stuff about China as long as every time you're introduced, you say, "Well, I'm not a China specialist. I'm an IR person who happens to know a lot about China." Thank God Ezra and some others like Dwight Perkins made it under the wire. Employing more quantitative methods and aiming for broader theory are noble goals. But that positive revolution combined with the devaluation or even repudiation of case studies, of country studies, of regional studies, has been a disaster for our understanding of much of the world. Methodological fetishism has impoverished us. Every social scientist should know how to do a regression. But what happens when scholars' promotions depend on doing regressions, and you're studying a country like China where there are no valid databases for the regressions? Well, what happens is people do regressions on invalid databases because that's the only way to get promoted. So for instance, you want to understand what the criteria are for being promoted in the Chinese bureaucracy. To study that, you need to know what their assignments were and whether they achieved their assignments. We don't have a database for that. We do know the GDP numbers. So we make the assumption that the only way to be promoted on merit is to increase the local GDP. So you assume away the official who was told to shut down half the steel mills in Hebei province, or the 30,000 little textile mills polluting the Yangtze. You throw away the official who was assigned to improve primary education or build a highway that's only going to improve the GDP 10 years later. You assume away the guy who was sent to Tibet and told suppress dissidents at any cost. That guy became Secretary General of the party for 10 years. Having assumed away the real issues, you reach the false conclusion that merit has no effect on promotions in China. Anybody who's spent any time in China knows something a little different. Ezra said that my takedown of that particular school in my book, China's Crisis of Success, was the most important contribution of the book to scholarship. But because they did regressions, that is one of the most influential findings in China scholarship today. Thank God for Ezra, who was part of the school where understanding reality comes first and finding an appropriate methodology comes second. Along with the fetish for regressions, there's a demand for grand theory. And so political economists, the leading political economists of our day, have come up with some propositions. Unlike democracies, autocracies cannot promote based primarily on merit. They're more dependent on elections. Unlike democracies, autocracies cannot implement long-range plans. Unlike democracies, autocracies cannot sustain growth. China, which appears to be an exception to these rules, we're told can't do creative, will fail because it can't do creative destruction. I could tell you some stories about Zhurongji doing creative destruction. Well, I worked with Pak Chung-hee's people, and he was fanatical about finding the best people. I worked with K.T. Lee and Sun Yat-sen and autocrat Zhang Jingguo's people in Taiwan, and the emphasis on getting the best people was extraordinary. The Taiwan cabinet had about as many PhDs in any single year as the U.S. cabinet has in a generation. And above all, I spent a good bit of time with alleged autocrat Lee Kuan Yew, who's probably put together the most merit-based system, certainly in the modern world, maybe in world history. So there's a problem with that kind of generalization. Similarly, on long-range planning, Zhang Jingguo's people had 1-year plans, 3-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, and even 30-year land use plans, and they almost always overachieved them. China's ability to map out long-range infrastructure plans and implement them probably exceeds anything in world history, unless you do discounts and stretch and include autocrats like Genghis Khan. So how do political economists at the world's leading universities come to such indefensible conclusions? There's a conceptual problem and an objectivity problem. Stretching for general theory, modern political economists usually divide the world into democracies and autocracies. Autocracies are places like Singapore and Somalia and the disintegrating Soviet Union. They're places like Pak Chung-hee's South Korea and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. like Zhang Jingguo's Taiwan and Khomeini's Iran. All the same kind of regime, right? The concept of autocracies is wonderful for political rhetoric. For analysis, not so much. Basically, you designate one category of things that you like and throw everything else into the other category. Invariably, the other category has a lot of bad stuff. So you can prove anything you want about in favor of the thing you like. Using that exact methodology, I can prove that Kyoto women are more beautiful than non-Kyoto women, and I can prove that eggplants are more tasty than non-eggplants. The concept of autocracies is a stir fry of yesterday's leftovers. For valid categories, go back to Aristotle. He had four kinds of good and bad democracies, four kinds of oligarchies, four kinds of dictatorships, and each one had very distinctive dynamics. Each one had very distinctive dynamics. He knew how to create a coherent class. Unfortunately, we've come a long way down in the last 2,500 years. Ezra knew how to do a regression. He appreciated good theories. Grand theory is the ultimate goal of all science. But if you're going to build grand theories, you have to do what physicists do and actually know what you're talking about first. Ezra knew what he was talking about. Why do we accept and reward these ideas based on invalid databases and indefensible concepts? Heavily because the conclusions are very reassuring. We love to hear that only people like us can develop and get rich. Only our systems can sustain a prosperity. Only our systems can implement long-range plans and hire good people. Ezra was as clear about his values as anyone, including democratic values, as anyone I've ever met. But he never let ideology or his particular values intrude on his research. I can't think of a single paragraph that he wrote that had any trace of ideology in it. That's a lesson to us all. Thank God for both Ezra's values and his objectivity. One of the great problems of academic life is silos. The silos enable specialization, but they also risk errors. There was a whole stratum of work about Japan, like Chalmers Johnson's and Carol von Werfelen's, that assumed that Japanese bureaucrats didn't have to pay any attention to supply and demand. They just manipulate prices any way they wanted to. The Japanese bureaucrats never made that mistake. Closer to home, contemporary IR theorists simply refuse to engage with the economics that today drive almost everything in international relations. Ezra drew eclectically from sociology, political science, economics, some anthropology, and he mastered the tools of each to the point where I can't think of a single place where he made the kind of errors that I just talked about. Thank God for Ezra's interdisciplinary skills. Ezra also knew multiple countries. Now, we have a lot of specialists who spend all their time on one country, and we need those. We need people who spend lives digging into China's language, China's history, China's politics, China's economics, China's technology, or Japan's, or Korea's, that accumulated knowledge is precious. But it's only useful when it's put into comparative perspective. If you've only ever seen the color black, you know very little about the color black. Because Ezra had both very deep knowledge and knowledge of and comparative perspective, he was able to explain systems that particularly earlier in his career were very exotic to Americans and Europeans. Well, so far I've defined Ezra's place in the firmament mainly by contrasting with other galaxies. What was his positive role? He explained systems. He explained how lifetime employment and just-in-time production and all sorts of other exotic things somehow fit together to make a system work. When he explained how market reform worked in Guangdong, he gave us an understanding of how the broader system functioned. He also explored developments like the emergence of Japan's middle class that changed the way the whole system looked. To me, Ezra's work was like that of an early biologist. He showed us how pieces of the system combined into a functioning whole. He explained what leaders were trying to accomplish and how the system either facilitated that or frustrated them. He showed us living, breathing societies. One of the consequences of displaying living, breathing societies was that Ezra's work was useful. If you were a business person or if you were a leader of another country, understanding what Ezra taught you helped you make decisions. One of the problems of the broad political economy is it's not useful. There's no way you can get from that to a decision. So we needed Ezra. Ambassador Chen told us yesterday that we need an Ezra for Southeast Asia. Well, now we need one or two or three for Northeast Asia too. But the reality is that today's economy will not nurture an Ezra. Ezra would probably have a very difficult time getting hired today here. And if he did, his early career might be crippled by running a bunch of silly regressions in order to get tenure. So where I've been going with all this is the best thing we could do to honor Ezra would be to rebalance the revolution of the 1960s. Keep the emphasis on sound methodology. Keep the search for grand theory, but ground it in reality. Ground it in the kind of systemic work that Ezra provided us for his whole life. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was a wonderful tribute from decades-long vantage point. Stephen, if I can turn to you as an eminent political economist in your own right now, but also from a unique vantage point of having your father set this out. I know there are a couple of intellectual puzzles that you and other political economists have had to grapple with, particularly with regards to Japan, and just want to invite you to speak about those and any other thoughts on the field from the vantage point of where you sit now.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the Asia Center and everyone for putting on this wonderful event. I really appreciate it. In thinking about this panel, I kind of asked myself, I wonder if I read my father's scholarship differently because I'm his son. And I quickly came to the answer, well, yes. First of all, I feel a kind of a filial obligation to at least open every book. But oddly enough, I don't feel the same obligation to finish them all. The other thing is I don't think that I have a real sense of scholarly detachment in terms of evaluating his scholarship. I see it through a certain lens. But today, as you suggested, I'd kind of like to focus on Japan because that's what I know. I don't cover quite as many countries as my father does for a few reasons. One, obviously, accident of birth. I was taken to Japan by my parents at age 13 against my will, but it's become a bad habit ever since. Second is, of course, Japan is pretty important. It may now have been bumped from second to third greatest economy in the world, but it's a pretty important country. But mostly I want to address what you mentioned, which is Japan is an intellectual puzzle. Particularly in political economy, I think the Japanese case offers a rich set of intellectual puzzles, maybe not unique to Japan, but where Japan plays a kind of a unique place. And I wanted to mention at first kind of one meta puzzle and two more narrower empirical puzzles. The meta puzzle is, how did Japan combine modernization with westernization? Right? That's kind of like one of the biggest questions in Japanese studies, whether they're looking at historically, sociologically, politically. And then two more specific empirical puzzles. What explains the phenomenal economic success of Japan from 1950 through, let's say, 1990? And then a more even narrow question, which is what explains the incredible failure after that, right? This is, Japan was kind of an outlier in both senses, and that if you look at the course of the 20th century, Japan is the most rapidly growing economy over that course of the entire century, right? It's also had the worst economic record of all rich democracies in the last decade of that century. So there's stuff to kind of like think about. And I think my father engaged with all of these puzzles, particularly the big meta one I think comes out in Japan's new middle class. And the more specific one of Japan's success comes out in Japan as number one. So I wanted to just kind of throw out some thoughts on each. As I talk about modern versus Western, I mean, at least when I went to graduate school, just your basic theory course was like 50 flavors of modernization theory, right? And they each have their nuances, but it's built on this idea of a dichotomy between a traditional society and a modern society. And the problem was that you couldn't separate modern from Western because all modern societies were Western until Japan, right? And that's when you start to say, and this is, I think it relates to what Bill was saying about theory and practice. Sometimes the reality challenges the theory, right? It's like, okay, it's not totally Western, but it's certainly modern, right? And so what my parents did is they looked at this in a very, very empirical way. They went and they spent 2 years in Japan and a very ethnographic kind of research method. They interviewed mostly 6 families. They lived with them for a full year and really got to know them. And it wasn't the detached scholar. They really got to know these families at an intimate level. But they got to see kind of what the modern Japanese family was, right? And it certainly was modern in the sense that these were salarymen and their families, right? And so they were executives of corporations. And so it was a differently structured economy, but they were still profoundly Japanese. And so you get to kind of see at the micro level how those different influences coexist and commingle. So and so I think that that research showed that Japan was not becoming Western. If you want to understand it, you have to understand it on its own terms. Okay, so then we come to the puzzle of the Japanese success. And many have ruminated about this. Bill mentioned Chalmers Johnson. Was it the developmental state? Was it something about society? Was it just that they got the economic fundamentals right? Was it distinctive features of organization like industry associations and labor unions? So I decided to go back and do a little remedial reading to see if I understood what my father was saying. And there's been, so I went down in the basement to his study, and it's been pretty well plundered over the last couple of years. And so there are no more, this was all I could find for Japan as number one. And you might notice right away that there's not that iconic big one that was in the first edition or the Mount Fuji that was in the paperback edition. And then in handwriting inside it says, pirated edition from Korea. But anyway, but if you just look at the chapter titles, this is Japanese successes, and it goes knowledge, the state, politics, the large company, basic education, welfare, crime control. This is a political scientist, by the way, is what I love about sociologists. They have no impulse to stay in their lane. Like there is nothing too micro or too macro for a sociologist. So in that sense, I think my father, so it was all of the above. But to be fair, he wasn't trying to write a kind of a detached scholar's work on what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese system. He was trying to pinpoint the strengths for an American audience. And he was very clear about that. But he did kind of give you a very full picture of the strengths of the Japanese system. And I think this is also another good example of research that starts with description and makes a prediction, right? In other words, that it's not from the theory, there's not a hypothesis that drives the prediction of the future. It's like deep knowledge of what's going on. And so he could see the Japan of the 1980s in the 1970s, not because he had any mysterious skill. He just asked enough questions that he figured out this is what's going to happen. And it did. And he got a certain amount of credit for that. So then that begets the question, okay, then in 1990, the Japanese economic milieu apparently goes sour, right? And so does that mean that he was wrong? Does that mean that we have to rethink our views of Japan? I'd say a couple things about this. One is I think that we follow maybe the GDP too much. In other words, that as scholars and certainly as pundits and business school professors or whatnot, we overanalyze both the successes and the failures. Japan was never quite as good as he described here. It's never quite as bad as the detractors would say in the 1990s. But I think Liz Perry mentioned the other book that he wrote afterwards, Is Japan Still Number One, where he did try to address this question of like, okay, things are not looking so good. What does this mean? And I think what he emphasized was that Japan's strengths were still Japan's strengths, right? That in terms of GDP growth, it had certainly declined. Part of that is because the population was not growing that much, but it's still a very well-organized society with low crime rates. And so there's a lot of strengths. And that to the extent there were weaknesses, there's a couple of sources for the change from hyper-success to failure. One is leadership, lack of leadership. Another was just allowing your own strengths to atrophy, right? In other words, a lot of people have said that Japan, failed to adapt to its failures. But some people would also argue it over-adapted, right? In other words, it started to emulate a U.S. model and to undermine its own strengths in terms of whether it be the education system or the strength of the bureaucracy or the ties between the bureaucracy and industry. So I think Dad would say Japan is down but not out, and that a lot of the strengths that he identified in his earlier research are still there. Thank you.
Kristen, I want to invite you to join this conversation, and I think It's interesting because both you're a student of Ezra's, but also you came into this field at a time when many of these trends that we're bemoaning here on this panel were established, and despite these trends, you were able to make a career in the field and embrace many of this pan-Asia, pushing back against simply the empirical types of methods and so forth. And certainly one can sense the influence in your work. And so I just wanted to invite you to join our conversation about the lasting legacy here in this field today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. It is true. I did manage to get a job with no regressions in my dissertation. And I still don't use that methodology. So there is still space for people with deep area expertise. I want to start off just by thanking everyone for including me today in this event to honor Ezra Vogel. And when I started preparing my remarks, I asked myself a really simple question. What have I learned from Ezra Vogel's work? Well, he was one of the very first people I met when I started my PhD at Harvard in 2005. We were at some kind of event reception right outside where the coffee and the food is today. And he walked over to me and some other graduate students and introduced himself, and he asked about our academic interests. And I told him that I was interested in studying China's rural political economy. And other professors, may have been like, that's great, and walk on by, but he smiled, a big smile. And he did not boast about his China credentials or expertise, even though I would soon learn that he was a giant in the field. I didn't know it at the time. Instead, he gave me several book recommendations, and then he told me that I should track down Nancy Hurst because she would help me get started on all the Chinese materials. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's only week 3 of my first year of graduate school. If I just committed to a dissertation project, he's already giving me book recommendations. But from that point on, I would regularly study at the Fung Library across the street from where we are now. And each time I was there, I saw Ezra Vogel. He was using the Fairbank Center collection for his research on Deng Xiaoping. And he seemed to be a fixture at the library. And a happy fixture at that. I mean, he would grin as he carried books back and forth between the carrel and the stacks. So his dedication to research was on full display right in front of me. So I think the first thing that I learned from Ezra was to read widely and to read deeply and to find a dedicated space where I could do that reading and where I could write. So one of the first books I read during graduate school was Canton Under Communism. And I remember just being totally wowed that he was able to glean so much from reading provincial newspapers and from doing interviews with former Chinese officials and citizens who were living in Hong Kong at the time. And what that book showed me was that focusing on one locality could still reveal as much about central power and central policy as a study of the center itself. And for somebody like me who was interested in a particular region or agricultural region or even very tiny villages, that was really encouraging. It encouraged me because it indicated that a local study could illuminate something big about Chinese politics. Then I learned that Ezra Vogel was not just a scholar of China, but he was a scholar of Japan. I didn't know that. I was very ignorant about who he was before I started graduate school. And not just Japan, but Korea and the whole East Asian region. And it's very easy to, I think, be wowed by his body of work. But in terms of his legacy for understanding political economy and markets, which is this panel's theme, I want to focus on what I think cross-national comparison reveals about East Asia's political economy, and on one thing in particular, which is the understudied importance of policy learning, which is a theme in many of his books. So what does cross-national comparison reveal? Vogel is one of several scholars who contributed to research on the so-called East Asian miracle. Many people have mentioned that today. In my reading of his work, Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, they are all places that modernized without becoming fully westernized. This is something that Stephen just mentioned. Ezra worked really carefully to explain how Japan and China successfully modernized their bureaucracies and their economies on their own terms, embracing technocratic governance and strategic state intervention in the markets at a time when neoliberalism and deregulation and the state getting out of the markets was the global norm. These countries did not fit the American mold, and as he boldly suggested, in Japan as number one, Americans could and should learn from Japan. Now, to me, the more interesting student of Japan was never the US, but China. So his work shows that Deng Xiaoping, and actually Hua Guofeng before him, who's been written off by many as a Maoist, they reformed China's economy with the Japanese model in mind. And exchanges between China and Japan really took off in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And when you read his book on Deng Xiaoping, you realize that the reform agenda was highly influenced by these exchanges. Of course, China's study of the Japanese model did not amount to a wholesale adoption of it, and many people have critiqued whether or not this developmental state model makes sense for understanding China. But I do think there are strong arguments to be made that China did start to resemble its neighbors, and that learning has had not just a flash-in-the-pan influence during that period of the late 70s, early 80s, but a sustained impact on the development not only of China, but of all countries in the Northeast Asian region. So as Ezra's work shows, there's a really long history of exchanges between Japan and China that predates, the 1970s. With each country actively learning from one another, with China being a model for Japan and vice versa. Now, this emphasis on learning, policy learning, is not common in the literature on political economy. More of that literature focuses on what I would call structural explanations or purely economic explanations about how economic institutions and policies emerged. So, for example, the famous flying geese model of Northeast Asian development suggests that technology moves from more advanced to less advanced countries as more advanced countries move up the global value chain. This model, of course, being historically grounded, acknowledges that Japanese colonialism played an important role in the region's development. But even in that kind of more qualitative historical tradition, I'm not sure that learning plays as prominent of a role as Ezra Vogel's work suggests that it did. So I just want to give one recent example I came across of how policy learning, I think, continues to influence political economy and works on political economy. I recently read Shelley Rigger's new book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, which details also a very intensive learning process between China and Taiwan. It's about how Chinese firms learned from Taiwanese investors in the mainland, from Taishang, and really internalize their business practices, including the practice of industrial clustering, which she argues was very, very important for China's takeoff. So that's another example of a recent political economy work that I think emphasizes policy learning as a driver of economic development. And then in my own work on rural policy and development, I've also found that East Asian countries copied each other quite often, and in many areas, including land reform, including cooperative development, the spread of green revolution technologies, as well as subsidies and other protections for farmers. I've also written about how mobilization campaigns have been important throughout the region. And if I was studying just one country, here's where I think the importance of taking Asia as a region seriously and doing cross-national comparison seriously pays off. If I had just studied one country, I would have missed that, mobilization campaigns are quite a broad, far-reaching phenomenon. If I was only studying China, I may have misattributed campaigns to the long shadow of Maoism. This is a leftover from an earlier period, rather than acknowledging that there's more complex origins than that this kind of tendency to use mobilization campaigns for development has also been influenced by the examples of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and beyond. So I think taking the region as a whole and looking at intra-regional comparison and cross-national comparison can illuminate quite a lot about important similarities and differences in these countries, and connections, ties, what I've called policy learning between them that drives a lot of convergence in the region. So there's much more I could say about his work, but that's all I've prepared for today. So I was also expecting a fourth panelist, so I think we have a little bit of extra time. But thank you so much for having me be part of this.
Well, thank you all for some thought-provoking comments, and I think we do have the benefit of time to really open up to the floor for questions and comments. I see many renowned folks who work on political economy in their own right. And so just wanted to join the audience, invite the audience to join the conversation. Please.
Yeah, my name is Rick Dyke. I have a question, I guess, for the panelists as well as for Ambassador Chen, actually. When Steve was talking about the Japanese economy not growing since the 1990s, Japanese companies have been growing, but have been growing outside of Japan. And yesterday in the... Is this on?
Yes.
Yesterday in the FDI statistics that the ambassador showed, she showed the attitude towards Japan, but she didn't show Japan's FDI statistics. And one thing, cumulative, I don't want to get into too much in the details, but cumulative FDI statistics are very difficult to come by because even the Japanese government doesn't track them very well. But you just have to track the repatriated profits from overseas Japanese companies to see that they've grown enormously. It's straight up to the right, no noise or regression since the 1990s. So the footprint of the economy has been growing. You only have to drive around Jakarta to see that every industrial park is basically populated with Japanese companies. That's true in Vietnam. So it has been growing, and the global footprint has been growing, and I think that also makes a difference. One thing that we should be worried about for the future is a lot of that investment is in the internal combustion engine and automobiles. So there, I think we have to think, what is the 10-year plan for that? And that would be similar for Korean investment. But I was always talking to Ezra about this. Don't sell Japan short as. You never said it is number one. You said as number one. But it's been growing, and it's been growing outside of Japan.
Ambassador, please.
I want to thank the panel for all your remarks, and they're very to the point. I want to speak on policy learning, which Kristen emphasized. And that's very important for the development of the economies. In my region, because we are learning all the time. Japan, as number one, had a great impact on Singapore, on Malaysia, and we invited Ezra Vogel to come and give lectures on it, trying to copy, many of the techniques, the arrangements of Japan. Japan, in fact, Mr. Dyke, right? Richard Dyke, was the spark plug of the industrialization of Southeast Asia. It was Japanese investments. I didn't put in the Japanese cumulative investment because I was focused on US-China, But I think we can get the data. We can get the data from the ASEAN Secretariat and compile.
That's right.
Right.
ASEAN has it.
Right, but this policy learning is extremely important in development, what has been emphasized. And I would say my country, Singapore, has raised it to the highest level. In this sense, we are always policy learning. We are not proud. If we look at education, if it is education for the, gifted, we would go around the world. And what would we do? We go to the United States, we'll go to a European country, we go to Japan or Korea, China, if it's relevant. So Israel, that's the other country. So policy learning is all over. And now we notice that other countries are interested in policy learning, in the desire to develop, whether it's the political economy or just grow. And Singapore, in fact, has a lot of countries coming to try to see what they can learn. And we keep saying, actually, we're a bit sui generis, but okay, we'll offer these courses if it suits you and if you find it useful. But there's a lot of learning. And in Southeast Asia, we are learning from each other. And India, the islands, the South, global South, is learning from each other.
I just take an attempt at Rick's question, which is kind of multifaceted, but I guess that's the main point I would make, is that if you try to assess a country's power or its performance, you've got just so many different metrics, right? And GDP is so kind of inadequate to that task. So if you're thinking about power, I mean, obviously you've got military power, but you also have the network power that you're talking about, right? And then there's soft power, and those are the 2 and 3 are dimensions where Japan tends to outperform, as opposed to military power, where they tend to be smaller than their economic footprint. And then if you just think about economic performance, right, obviously there's GDP, there's per capita GDP, which is already going to make Japan look better than aggregate, right, because you have a shrinking population. But then you have all kinds of different aspects of social performance, and I think that's what my father would emphasize, is there's continuing strength. And I think the most dramatic one for that would be Japan's performance with this pandemic, right, which has been, in terms of best outcome for least disruption, Japan has to score very high on that one.
Thanks. Jed Schwartz is from Somerville, is a writer. I've been reading Michael Hudson, and he's a political economist, a radical political economist. He's been described as both the fascist and the communist, in his most recent book, highly spoken of by certain Chinese individuals in the academy. I don't know what their affiliation is. His thesis is that the United States is practicing something that he calls financial imperialism. And I've read 3 of his books, and I take them fairly seriously. I don't agree with, by any means, all of his recommendations, but I'm just wondering whether any of the panelists or anyone in the room, for that matter, is at all familiar with this thesis, because it's complementary to, it supports the Russian, the Putin thesis that the problem is that Ukraine is aligned with the corporate West, and the corporate West is, well, what Putin says is, you know what Putin says about the corporate West, but this thesis that the United States, actually his thesis is that the United States elites, private sector elites, are benefiting to the nines, through the nose, through this corporate system. And if you look at the household wealth, those figures reflect that there actually has been a great influx of capital into the United States private sector. Anyway, I won't say anymore. I'm wondering whether anybody is at all familiar with this thesis, whether anybody thinks it has any validity, and is it all relevant, and what Ezra Vogel might have said about it were he here. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with Michael's latest stuff, but let me just say a few words. First of all, whatever you say about the financial policies of the United States and its corporations, it has nothing to do with Putin's thesis about Ukraine. There was not substantial U.S. economic involvement in Ukraine. The involvement that was there certainly would not harm Russia in any way. We do have enormous influence because of our corporate strength and our financial strength and the U.S. dollar. And we sometimes abuse that, the overuse of sanctions in all sorts of places. But I think you can criticize it at the tactical level. We make mistakes here. Saying that every company that does anything in China has to affirmatively prove that there's nothing in its supply chain connected with Xinjiang. That's absurd. That's self-harm. All it does is to harm our own companies. It doesn't do any good for Xinjiang. And by the way, it hurts exactly those companies that are doing the most for the Uyghur people. There's a lot of reason for criticizing the tactics that the U.S. uses, the overuse of sanctions, which ultimately is going to hurt ourselves, destroys our own influence. But these gigantic conspiracy theories ultimately don't have any substance.
One of the most interesting themes to emerge from this panel is this process of learning from one another, the interreferential nature of Asian relations, not least in the field of political economy. But I just wondered whether or not there is a greater historical depth to this process than has been suggested. I'm thinking of literature that has emerged from economic historians, for example, Sugihara and Austin's edited volume on labor-intensive industrialization in global history, which would suggest that Japan had been setting an example from the Meiji period onwards, from the late 19th century, and especially an emphasis on basic education, formal schooling, an emphasis on family-based rural industries, and so on. And some of the other Asian countries decided to learn from that model. I mean, even in India, in the Swadeshi era of 1905, there were students going to Japan to try and learn something from this process of labor-intensive industrialization. And so there is a long history. I mean, unfortunately, I think that post-independence India, unlike Singapore and some of the other Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian countries, did not emphasize land reforms or basic education or health as much as we might have. There's more of a learning process going on now. So, perhaps we could add a little bit of historical depth to what has been a very interesting insight that has emerged from the discussions in this panel. Even banking, Shibusawa Eiichi, leading the way in making sure that clever financial and banking reforms can in fact be the basis for a major economic breakthrough. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, since there have been two comments about learning, I guess I'll just offer a few thoughts on that. One is I think Ezra Vogel has paved the way for taking a long historical view. So the last book that he published about Sino-Japanese relations dates all the way back to the Tang Dynasty, showing intensive exchanges between China and Japan, in which Japan was mostly the student of China at that period of time. And then, of course, you're right that Japan is not just looking to China, but to countries much farther off, in Europe and elsewhere for information about how to modernize. I think there is something to be said about the Meiji Restoration or Deng Xiaoping's transition away from state socialism as it was under Mao. These moments of intensive modernization being periods of really high intensity learning. And so we should study those moments to understand what the different influences are. And when I talk about policy learning as an influence on China's political economy or some other country's political economy, I'm not trying to suggest that there is, exact replica copying going on. It's really somebody I know use the term policy collaging. It's really like a collage that's being created, taking influences from different things, different examples, and putting them together and adapting to the context. But I think with respect to learning within East Asia, there are a few factors that have driven this for hundreds of years, if not longer, which are, the Japanese colonialism, U.S. occupation, U.S. facilitating learning among different countries within the region, geographic proximity, cultural closeness, also the Cold War rivalries. South Korea and Taiwan both looking at North Korea and China and Japan as not only rivals but also models, right? There's kind of two sides to that coin of looking at the other as a rival and a model, which is really intensifying this learning process. And I think that that's still an important dynamic for understanding the origins of many policies in the regions. And I guess the last thing I'd say about learning and why it's so important in this context is that the Chinese Communist Party, I've talked a lot about China because China was kind of my first entry into Asian studies. Chinese Communist Party has been pragmatic for as long as it has existed, right? And it has always experimented with policies and, come up with the best policy through trial and error. We think about Deng Xiaoping as the ultimate pragmatist, but the party itself as an institution has been pragmatic since the 1920s. And so perhaps for that reason, it's also more inclined as a political party to engage in this type of cross-national exchange and learning.
If I may add a thought here of my own, especially because Meg is not here, and I think she would have quite a bit to add on to this question. I think it's interesting that the nodes of policy learning happen not just with each other across their own capitals, but also oftentimes in the West. And so the latest book, right, also touched on how China and Japan learn from each other, but through joint missions going out to civil law countries in Germany and France and so on and so forth. And we see that even here today, right, where at this point about thinking about how to deal with post-industrial societies, social inequality and so forth. There's a lot of policy experimentation going on and a lot of even folks here at Harvard from these different countries looking at what each other are doing, looking at what the United States is doing and debating that amongst one another. So I think it's part of a long tradition there. And I think it's important for those of us who are in the field of Asian studies to remind those who are not that there is a lot of experimentation happening even within countries. And Meg would point to, right, the Chongqing model as a version of that. And there's still many more versions of that. And that's borrowing not just from one country, but what one is seeing. And if you look at a place like India, also the policy experimentation that's happening within states. And the actors that help to facilitate this being sometimes formal channels like development assistance aid, ODA, JICA, and the like, but also now with Belt and Road, right, another means by which this is being, but also then through firms. And I think Professor Vogel's work brought that whole sort of ecosystem, to use what Bill was describing, right, together to sort of highlight all of that. And I think it's very much a live part of what is modern Asia today, and one that we need to remind others not to be so reductionist in terms of the way they look at Asian political economy.
Christina Davis. I thought this was really interesting to consider policy learning, but I also wondered to tie it into political economy and thinking what has been the means of foreign capital in that process, and especially thinking about if the Japan model was more about how it drew on foreign ideas, but there weren't as many joint ventures until recently.
Yeah.
And then we've had this surge in the last 20 years of foreign firms entering the Japanese market. Has that changed corporate governance in Japan? How does it compare where China would have joint ventures and the type of learning you get when you have this model of getting foreign technology through joint ventures?
I can take a stab at that. I mean, I think that foreign investment, both direct investment and portfolio investment, has had a major impact on the corporate governance debate in Japan. And so that's where the pressure has come for Japan to change their practices. And what's fascinating to me is that the Japanese the Japanese reformers feel that they have to cater to the foreign investors, right, and give them a corporate governance that is more legible to them, right, which doesn't just mean more transparent. It means starting to adopt more Western or American practices, like more outside directors, stock options, share buybacks, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time that reformers in the United States are saying we need to move more towards a kind of a stakeholder model of corporate governance, right? So you've got it going both ways. But to your point, I think that what has really transformed the Japanese debate has been the foreign investors, and as the share of foreign ownership in the Japanese stock market has increased, there's definitely been a strong movement to try to give the foreigners what they want. But at least, for example, under Abe, I think this relates to our earlier conversation about performance metrics, because I think some of it was just short-term feeling that if you don't, at least superficially, change the corporate governance model, then that's going to undermine foreign investment in the stock market, right? And that's going to be bad for the stock market. And so we don't want that. So let's do let's at least make it look like we're doing what the foreign investors want, and keep the market up, and then you have a lot of Japanese corporations still trying to do business as usual because they don't really believe in the spirit of those reforms.
I can add something on that really quickly. For comparison between Japan and China, your question made me think of this article by Min Ye, who's a professor at Boston University, and she was writing about how there was this intensive effort on the part of Chinese reformers in the early 1980s and late 70s to study the Japanese model. And one thing that central government thinkers wanted to do was basically protect the Chinese market from foreign investment and kind of build up these large conglomerates. It's similar to Japanese zaibatsu, but they wanted to not embrace foreign direct investment immediately. And yet she argues in the article that that's a case where policy learning didn't work. So instead, that lesson learned from Japan was not implemented because what happened was there was a lot of bottom-up pressure from local governments that were wooing or maybe being pressured by overseas Chinese capital that wanted to come into the mainland. They were trying to attract this foreign direct investment. And so this kind of bottom-up pressure to allow a greater role for FDI in the country ultimately won out. So there were these kind of different competing visions of how to move toward a market economy, and that's a case where local governments who were not necessarily taking tours of Japan to study the Japanese model, they had ultimately a greater influence on the outcome than central level officials. So learning occurred, but those lessons aren't always transmitted.
I would just add to that I think that China learned a lot more from the South Korea and Taiwan models than it did from the Japan model. Those were the ones Deng Xiaoping studied the most. I wrote a book in 1993 called The Rise of China, How Economic Reform is Creating a New Superpower. And later people asked me, how come none of the real China specialists wrote that book? Well, I spent so much time in Japan and Korea and Taiwan that I could see that Deng Xiaoping was just copying primarily the lessons of South Korea and Taiwan. The country specialists couldn't necessarily see that. China, substantial factions in China, especially Li Peng, wanted to copy Singapore, but they had a problem scaling up a lot of the Singapore experiences, which were unique to a smaller city-state. I would just add that because Japan was reconstructing an industrial economy. South Korea and Taiwan were building one from scratch, as China was, but a generation earlier than China. And so you can learn a lot about China by studying the experiences of Taiwan and South Korea. And I mean, for me, the initial one was, hey, these techniques work if you can scale them up, and it turns out you can. But the second one, which I wrote about in a book called China's Crisis of Success, is that after a generation of 10% growth, you hit what I call a crisis of complexity. The economy becomes too complicated to manage out of the president's office, and the companies become so big they start to capture parts of the state, and demonstrations go like this, and you can see what's going to happen in China by looking at what happened in South Korea and Taiwan. But the smaller countries acceded to the crisis of complexity. They accommodated it. They moved to market economics and market politics. Xi Jinping is trying to fight the crisis of complexity, and that means the repression has to be very severe, and as the more the economy succeeds, the more it becomes complicated, the more pressure groups you get, the more you have to repress and repress and repress. The other analogy that I think is very important, and I've written a lot about this, the risk to China of Japanification. And they talk about it all the time now, that if you rely on the big companies and the central guidance of those companies, that those companies end up owning the system. And you get stagnation, you get social problems. So the theme of emulation is exactly the right theme. And there's tremendous value from just digging deeper and deeper.
So we have time maybe for one last question.
I just want to ask, so what's the implication of Chinese economy reconfiguration, or when they are dealing with the complication of economy, what's the influence to the regional economy such as Taiwan, Korea, and Japan? I mean, if China is weakening due to failing to deal with the crisis, will China take any military action or take any strange move toward other countries? Thank you.
I'll take that one on. In the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of voices, Mahathir in Malaysia, the whole American press, saying that China's growth is going to drive out growth from, take away growth from the region. Not only did Chinese growth drive regional growth, Chinese growth drove FDI into places like Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia. The correlations were all positive. Win-win, as they would say. As it weakens, the effect on regional growth is obviously weakening. This is very geopolitically important because, again, if you look how these countries work, you get 10% for 20, 25 years, and you get 7% for a few years, and you get 2 or 3%. And the geopolitical consequence, and China's potential growth, I've got an article coming out about this, in the 2030s will probably be 2 to 3% at most, minus the effect of Xi Jinping's political controls, and that has vast geopolitical consequences, because up to now China has been the only source. If you're looking at from Malaysia, the source of growth in the world is China. Everything else is negligible by comparison. As you get into the 2030s, the influence of Chinese growth will be about the same as the influence of American growth and about the same as the influence of European growth. And that's going to make the relative magnetism of China just incredibly smaller compared to what it is today. So we all benefit when China grows. Our stock market goes down when the Chinese GDP growth rate goes down. But there's a reversion to the mean that's going on worldwide that's going to make geopolitics very different in the future.
Well, maybe just to close on a slightly more upbeat note than that downbeat forecast, I think one of the questions it does raise, and since we've talked so much about the importance of the Asia Center's work expanding into Southeast Asia, it just means that there are other engines of growth within Asia. Mm-hmm. And I think this work on political economy is so fundamental because it shows that takeoff happens because a whole series of factors align in that political economy. And for us here to deepen our understanding of those political economies and draw on what Ezra's legacy has been as the tools and not simply just reduce those to regressions and looking at data sets and so forth, but really to understand that society. I think there's a lot of work for us to do in terms of driving that forward with real implications for human welfare and well-being. So on that note, maybe a bit more upbeat, please join me in thanking the panel.
This is still on. There we go. Thank you to Mark and Bill, Stephen, and Kristen as well. That was really interesting. And I think, thank you, Mark, for bringing that back around. Actually resonated very much, I think, with Ambassador Chan's keynote last night as well about what needs to be done and where the future may lie. So thank you very much. And also, thanks to the panel, we've now clawed back about 15 minutes or so. And I think we're inching back to an on-time place in our schedule. We're still about 15 minutes behind, so let's see, what time is it right now? I don't know if that clock is accurate. Is it? It is accurate. Okay, so let's come back around, let's say 3:15, 3:20 in that zone, and then we'll move on. And actually, we'll begin to now bring South Asia more into the picture here. We've had East Asia and Southeast Asia in conversation, and now South Asia will start to make more of an appearance as well. So we'll see you back in just about 15 minutes. Thank you.